He was a charismatic, passionate, and persuasive teacher. He instantly won the respect and trust of nearly everyone he encountered, which was a lot of people. Having traveled across the country preaching the gospel, he was a source of comfort to many, perhaps too many. The good pastor had a bad pastor's side. It would not be the first time that a pastor had been led astray, but this time would be far more sinister than most. As his wife lay dying in their home, his friends, his congregation, the entire community would soon know how bad a small-town preacher's bad side could actually be. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Some titles we are born into, some we earn, and some we steal. Today we'll be talking about a man that didn't deserve any of his titles. Husband, father, pastor. Follow along to learn how this man used his ill-gotten titles to epically betray everyone who trusted him, carrying out his facade right up until the bitter end. And before we start, if you like this video or any of our videos, we'd be ever so grateful if you'd hit like, subscribe, and preferably share. We're grateful for your support. Let's go. This case starts out as a love story. Timothy Dane Tillman, who went by Tim, met Janet Loretta, and they fell in love. In December of 1983, the couple married and looked forward to beginning their lives together. Within a few years, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Jessica, in 1986. Then, a few years later in 1991, they welcomed his second daughter, Tiffany. The small family had settled in Jacksonville, Florida, and remained there for a few years after Tiffany was born. It's not uncommon for pastors to relocate for new pastoral opportunities, and in 1995, the family moved from Florida to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then in 2003, with 10 years of preaching under Tim's belt, the couple, now in their early 40s, relocated their family again. This time to Vincent, Alabama, a small town of just 2,000 residents. In Vincent, Janet worked full-time and Tim continued preaching. He started out as a guest speaker at a church called Vincent Revival Center. His powerful and charismatic delivery and style captivated the congregation. One of the elders commented on how he was quite possibly the best speaker she had ever heard from the pulpit. He was a perfect match for the church. So they felt like they had scored a major win when he agreed to be their pastor after being elected by the congregation. Tim thrived at the church. His charisma and ability to move the crowd gained him the respect and adoration of his grateful and loyal congregation. And Janet, being by his side, bolstered the love and respect the congregation had for the whole family. She was kind, humble, a wonderful mother, and a supportive wife. She was described as the glue to the family, the one who helped Tim shine. Tim, or Pastor Tillman, described charity as being one of his missions from God, and he prided himself on being charitable. Given that calling, in September of 2005, Pastor Tillman suggested that the church sponsor a fundraiser to raise money for the victims of Hurricane Katrina, a devastating hurricane that had struck Louisiana and the Gulf Coast the prior month. He proposed a turkey shoot to be held on each Saturday in October. The turkey shoots would raise money by charging participants for each shell that they would then load into the rifles. Participants would then shoot target pictures of turkeys, aiming to get as close to the target photos as possible. The process was straightforward, and participants were helped and guided along the way. On the third week of the turkey shoot, one of the guns jammed. At the end of the event, one of the church members offered to take the jammed gun to get it fixed. Pastor Tillman politely thanked him, but said that he wanted to take the guns home for safekeeping. So Tillman and two church members checked the weapons to make sure they were unloaded, then placed them into the trunk of Tillman's vehicle. A few days later, Tim arrived home to the church parsonage where he and his family lived next door to the church. It was about 45 minutes before the Wednesday night service was supposed to start. The guns were still in his trunk, and Janet greeted him outside to help unload them. He handed her one gun to carry in, and then he grabbed the other two weapons to carry inside himself. She carried her gun into the house. Tim followed closely behind and suggested they hide the guns under the bed. Janet proceeded to the bedroom with her husband still close on her heels. Then, as Tim crossed the threshold to their bedroom, he said that one of the guns he was carrying struck the side of the door jamb and caused the gun to fire. striking his wife in the back. Janet collapsed to the floor. Their two daughters, who were just feet away, came rushing into the room, understandably distraught. And so was their father. He had shot his wife. As she lay there bleeding, she told her husband that she loved him. Then she told her daughters that she loved them as well. The 40-year-old mother died right afterward. Churchgoers who were gathering for the Wednesday service scheduled to take place just 100 yards away noticed the ambulance and emergency vehicles at the neighboring parsonage. They headed over to witness their distraught pastor. He was inconsolable. His beloved wife and mother of his children was gone. The weight of guilt of the tragic accident seemed to be weighing heavily on him. He covered his face with his hands and rocked back and forth, wailing, "What have I done? What have I done?" over and over again. They were heartbroken for him. As a formality, the police brought the pastor to the station to give a statement, but they had no reason to doubt his account of the events. He acknowledged that he was holding the gun that fired the fatal shot, but insisted that it had accidentally fired, striking Janet in the back. He was released to return and mourn with his daughters. The church community swiftly rallied around the pastor and his daughters, and as they witnessed the grieving man's distraught state of mind, their concern for him grew. So much so that the church elders removed any weapons or knives from his house to ensure that he didn't have access to anything that could bring him harm. Sue Garrett, who was one of those church elders, took the grieving girls in to live with her and her family. Sue herself tried to stay strong for the girls' sake, but she too was heartbroken by such a tremendous loss to a loving family. A couple weeks after the shooting, Pastor Tillman announced that he was leaving to go out of state on a pastor's retreat. Sue and the other elders were concerned and a little confused by him leaving his daughters so soon after they lost their mother, but they trusted that he was doing what he needed to do to manage his grief. In addition to mourning with the pastor in the aftermath of the blameless accident, his church family also helped support him financially, including cash gifts to help offset the loss of Janet's income. His claims that he was in need financially made them even more sympathetic to his situation, and they had no reason to doubt anything he was saying. But Janet's family did. When Janet's sister Joan heard the news of her sister's shooting, she immediately called their brother. His reaction was instant. "This is no accident. Something doesn't feel right." He felt that there was more to the story, and Joan herself, having been privy to inside information about the couple's relationship, either firsthand or from Janet, was skeptical as well. The family's suspicions were stronger than ever after a meeting they had with Pastor Tillman, where he never once apologized to them for the death of their beloved Janet. Instead, he just repeatedly professed how it wasn't his fault. After that meeting, Janet's sister Joan was determined to fight for justice for her sister. Worried that the local police department lacked the resources to properly investigate the case, she emailed state authorities at the Alabama Bureau of Investigations, or the ABI, urging them to look deeper into the case. They responded, and Detective Scott Bartle was assigned to the case. He dived right in, and what he uncovered was a background, a secret, a life that had flown under all of his followers' radar. Starting with his police interview. The real Tim Tillman actually began revealing himself as early as his first encounter with detectives. One of Detective Bartle's first orders of business was to review the video of Tillman's interview with police at the station shortly after the incident. In it, Bartle was immediately struck by what he described as Tillman acting. He noticed how he would be dramatically sobbing one moment, then stopping instantly and glancing at the clock. It set off a huge red flag for the detective, who immediately became suspicious. The detective also learned from local authorities that they had searched for Tillman in a criminal database and discovered that he had two different driver's licenses, one with the name Timothy Dane Tillman, and the other, Timothy Patrick McNally. He had changed the name on his license to McNally a few months before the shooting, but then just a few days before the shooting, he changed it back to Tillman. They had no idea why, but both the local police and Bartle were eager to follow where it led, confident that it would be nowhere good. And they were right. After more digging, they found that his moves from state to state were often driven by scandal every couple of years, forcing him out. Either because of money issues, inappropriate encounters with women, and more. As he migrated from state to state and congregation to congregation, Tillman would be caught in strip clubs or other establishments considered unholy that would ultimately result in him being terminated as pastor. Janet stuck by her husband, trying to make their marriage work despite the hurt, pain, and often humiliation. But instead of things getting better, they just got worse. In 1999, after being run off to Minnesota, he landed another pastoral role there. And having not learned his lesson from the results of his last scandal, he began another seedy affair with a church member there. So, that was the end of that. But it got even worse. After being terminated yet again, he landed a normal people job at the front desk of the local jail, checking people in and out. Then one day, as he was helping a prostitute who was just released check out, he offered her a ride home. On the way, he forced her to perform acts on him. She reported him, and he was arrested. He pleaded guilty to solicitation of a prostitute and was ordered to serve 6 months in jail. Tim Tillman had finally landed himself behind bars, and Janet had finally had enough. She went to stay with her sister Joan so that she could break off from Tillman and become independent. Her sister encouraged her and advised her that it was time to finally give up on Tillman. She was even able to get Janet a job where she worked. Janet and the girls moved in with Joan, and everything was going well. Until Tillman was released early and came knocking. He apologized profusely to Janet and promised to be better. She hoped that he would. So, she took him back. And then there was Molly. When Bartle checked Tillman's phone records, he found that he had numerous and regular late-night calls to a woman named Molly Bizzari. Tim Tillman was having an affair. Putting all of the pieces together, Bartle uncovered the pastor's double life. He had met Molly 10 years prior, and while he was telling Janet that he was away on church retreats and other pastoral business, he was actually off living his second life with his mistress. Molly, on the other hand, was led to believe that her boyfriend was a divorced U.S. Navy SEAL officer named Timothy McNally. He'd even gone so far as to obtain parts of a Navy uniform, perhaps from a surplus store, and sent a picture of himself in the uniform to Molly, complete with a name badge bearing his fictitious name. His driver's license bearing the same name was likely used to further bolster his charade. Molly was shocked when she received a visit from authorities revealing Tim's true identity. 5 months before the shooting, Tillman wrote letters to Molly, telling her that he looked forward to her being a mother figure to his daughters and becoming his wife. Then, just 2 months before the shooting, he actually proposed to Molly. They were officially engaged at the time of Janet's death. Tillman had succeeded in hiding his mistress from everyone and hiding everyone from his mistress. Until after his wife's death. About 2 months after Janet's death, Tillman's daughter Tiffany actually came across some correspondence that Tillman had written to Molly and got into an argument with him about it. She felt that it was too soon after her mother had died. She told both Sue and her Aunt Joan about the correspondence. So Tillman was now on Sue's radar. And Joan promptly contacted Bartle, alerting him that Tillman may have a girlfriend named Molly, confirming what Bartle had suspected from the phone records. The case against Tillman was building. Authorities wondered how Tillman managed to get appointed as a pastor with such a checkered past, especially the solicitation conviction from Minnesota. So, they reached out to his current church, Vincent Revival, to find out. Turns out that he had successfully evaded scrutiny by simply not turning in the required application that would trigger a background check. He would give excuses to the governing church officials like he had misplaced the application or spilled something on it. A full 7 months after Janet's death, he still had not turned in the application that would authorize his background check. And instead, he resigned, officially changed his name to McNally, and moved to Florida. And of course, there was a life insurance policy. In 2001, a life insurance policy was taken out on Janet, with her husband, naturally, named as the primary beneficiary. With all of the findings, authorities were confident that Tillman had intentionally killed his wife, but they couldn't prove it. At that point, Tillman's congregation, which he was still leading, had generally remained supportive of him. But several of the elders had already begun to see cracks in his actions. From the correspondence that Tiffany had witnessed, to Tillman's ill-timed retreat, to the probing questions Bartle had asked them about Tillman's application and background checks, they had their suspicions. But it was after they actually met with Bartle that their suspicions were fully converted into certainty. With Bartle having quietly worked on the case behind the scenes for months, he decided it was time to have a face-to-face meeting with the elders to present his findings and learn any additional information from them that he could. During their meeting, the elders learned that Tillman did indeed have a mistress, and that she just so happened to live in the same state as the supposed retreat that the pastor had suspiciously jetted off to shortly after his wife's death. They learned about his arrest for solicitation, his fake ID, and more. Bartle even showed them a photo of Tillman or McNally in his fake Navy uniform. The elders realized their pastor was a fraud who had likely murdered his wife. One elder stated, "I looked at him and I said, we were fools." Another elder declared, "I felt spiritually raped. You feel totally betrayed." Detective Bartle had uncovered numerous motives for Tillman to kill Janet, but it was all circumstantial. He wanted to be sure that he had a solid case. Then, Tim slipped up, providing the break the detective needed. About 5 months after Janet's death, an insurance company tried to reach Janet at the job where she had worked with her sister. Joan took the call and explained that Janet no longer worked there. The call was regarding a $5,000 unsolicited loan that a bank had offered to Janet that she had accepted. Joan asked what date the check for the loan was issued and signed. They replied that it had been signed nearly 3 months after Janet had been killed. Joan promptly shared the information with Detective Bartle. They found that Tim Tillman had signed his wife's name to the check, which constituted a forgery. The forgery finally gave Bartle a cause for arresting Tillman and gathering more evidence. At the beginning of 2007, Tillman was arrested and brought back to Alabama on the forgery charge. Suspecting that Tillman was a talker and was swift to anger, Bartle looked forward to Tillman getting easily riled up and unwittingly incriminating himself during an interrogation, and he knew exactly how to egg him on. They started out by discussing the forged check. Tillman acknowledged the forgery and claimed he needed the money to pay for Janet's headstone and cover household expenses for his family. Then they moved on to the shooting. Bartle played naive. His soothing southern drawl allowed him to play the hick detective who was baffled, fascinated, and sympathetic about how the weapon had accidentally discharged. Bartle stated, "You really have me intrigued about this accident. Can you draw me the house and everything like that? I'm kinda silly at times, I guess." And Tillman played right into it, detailing how it all went down and adding more detail to the detective's follow-up questions when he said that things did not make sense to him. But as his questions became more confrontational, Tillman grew more agitated and ultimately outraged. He eventually began angrily shouting his side of the story and literally beating his chest. But most importantly, his accounts were inconsistent. Bartle said that during the interrogation, Tillman provided at least 7 different versions of what happened. Although Detective Bartle felt he had enough after the interrogation to convict Tillman for Janet's murder, it still wasn't enough to charge him. He remained in jail on the forgery charge for about 6 months until he was able to post bond. As Bartle continued working the case, Tillman tried to return to Molly. She was originally angry with him and confused by his lies, but Tillman simply made up new lies to draw her back in. He told her that he was on a mission for a secret agency of the US government and couldn't share the details. He promised her that once the mission was complete, they could continue their lives together. And they did. They got married shortly after Tillman posted bond. But their happiness was short-lived. Before the year was out, a grand jury chose to indict 43-year-old Tillman for the murder of Janet Tillman. It was the moment Janet's family and the detective had waited for. Timothy Tillman was arrested and his bond was set at $500,000. The case was going to trial. At trial, Tillman was facing both the forgery charge and the murder charge combined into the same trial, with the prosecution successfully claiming that the 2 crimes were related and part of a common plan. The prosecution painted a picture of a sick man who killed his wife to collect the proceeds from her life insurance, prevent or delay being exposed for the fraudster and criminal that he was, and marry his mistress. They presented testimony that showed that the shooting could not have occurred as Tillman said it did. The defense countered with their own firearm expert that testified that the shooting was consistent with it being an accident. Many on the victim's side worried that the case was purely circumstantial, and it was. However, the prosecution had 2 witnesses that removed nearly all speculation about Tillman's guilt. They were the church members who helped Tillman with the guns after the turkey shoot. After Tillman had politely refused the offer to have the gun fixed and insisted on taking it home for safekeeping, Jimmy Abbott had personally checked each weapon to make sure they were all unloaded. He testified that he was positive those guns were unloaded. After Abbott had checked the guns, another church member named Mark Green, along with Tillman himself, rechecked each weapon again, making sure they were unloaded. It was a devastating blow to the defense. And if that wasn't enough, the prosecution also presented evidence that Tillman attempted to alter the testimony of his daughter, Tiffany. They presented letters that he had written to Molly from jail, where he had made line-by-line suggestions recommending changes that Tiffany should make to her previous affidavit testimony to police, including, seemed like he was carrying the guns chest height and was repositioning them as he walked. Maybe she could say that, "I don't think my dad knew I was in the room. She needs to communicate that I have not coached her. My dad already explained to me his previous relationship with Molly, and he already explained to Molly about his marriage to Mom." Despite what the correspondence documented, Tiffany testified that she did not alter her affidavit statements at the request of her father. The defense asked her, "Are those affidavits the truth? Did you make any change to that affidavit based on anything your dad said to you?" She responded, "They are the truth. Dad was in jail at that time." So then the prosecuting DA asked her, "Did Molly look over your affidavit before you mailed it back?" She replied, "Yes, she wrote over it after I got done with it, mostly just to make sure my punctuation and everything was right." The prosecution argued that Tillman's attempt to influence his daughter's testimony was evidence of his consciousness of guilt. The depths of Tillman's manipulation and influence over his daughters and his mistress, and the reality of how much they did or did not know, is unknown. In October of 2009, 4 years after the murder, after 2 hours of deliberation, Timothy Tillman was found guilty. 2 months later, he was sentenced to 10 years for the forgery charge and the maximum sentence of life in prison for the murder charge. As he was led away, Tillman showed no emotion, not even a glance back at his children. No need for charades anymore. Janet's family had finally received justice. They and law enforcement couldn't help but ponder that had Tillman not forged Janet's name on that check, whether he may have gotten away with murder. In 2011, the Equal Justice Initiative fought to have Timothy Tillman's convictions overturned. They argued that trying the forgery and murder charges at the same time was improper and unfairly prejudiced the jury. The court agreed. Tillman's murder conviction was overturned. He was tried again on the murder charge. And in 2012, he was convicted for a second time and sentenced again to life in prison. He appealed the murder conviction in 2017 and lost. He tried to appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court after that, but they refused to hear his case. He appealed to the lower courts once more in 2018 and was denied again. Tillman was originally sent to serve out his sentence at Limestone Correctional Facility in Harvest, Alabama, but at some point he was transferred to Hamilton Work Release Center in Hamilton, Alabama. Hamilton is a minimum custody facility that houses inmates that perform community services or civilian jobs in the surrounding communities. Tillman is classified under one of the lowest custody designation inmates can receive, allowing him to be assigned to off-property work details without direct supervision. He will be eligible for parole in the year 2029. We hope this video did justice to Janet Tillman. Cases like this always beg the question, do these pastors who have, quote, gone astray actually believe what they're preaching and are choosing a path they know to be wrong? Or do they not believe a word of what they're teaching and are just there to collect the cash? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts about this case in the comments below. And if you like how we presented this case, we'd really appreciate you hitting like and share, and definitely hit subscribe so you never miss a single video.